Welcome, everyone. Good to see you all on this Wednesday of our summer session. Um, I was inspired enough by Corin's talk, was that yesterday, to do things a little bit differently from the way I do usually, which is I actually wrote my talk point by quite, one line after another in the same way she did, because hers was so articulate. And usually what I use is index cards, and that just gives me the points. And then I go along on that. But somehow after hearing her, I just went to the computer and started writing, and it came out like a written talk. So we'll see how this works. I usually like to be kind of off the cuff, but we'll see how far off the cuff I can go and still have a script. So I want to talk today about my favorite subject, the radical core of the Buddha's teaching of no self. So the purpose of the Buddha's method, and also our Bodhisattva vows, is of course to save beings from suffering. And a main point of this radical insight of the Buddha is no self equals no suffering. So I think most of us can grasp this intellectually, but no self is not a theory or a belief or any kind of conceptual concept or insight. It's an experience, so we have to experience it directly to know its reality. Of course, that's our business here in Sesshin, at least in part. But I think for many practitioners, the actual experience of letting go of the self continues to seem kind of esoteric and distant and far away. The kind of thing we might realize after 10 or 20 more years of practice. I mean, if anybody ever really gets to it anyway, or if it really ever happens, or if I have what it takes to see it, which I probably don't do. I know I don't think so. So all of that stuff gets in the way, right? Of course, it's a true intuition. In a way, the small self can't realize no self. That's it's a contradiction in terms, but it's not as though our true self nature, which is no self, is any distance from it. It's closer from us. It's closer than we can imagine. Some people even find the prospect a little bit scary, like, oh, if I lose myself, will I vanish? Will I lose my mind? Will my personality go away? What will be left of me? Well, first off, you can't really lose anything that isn't there in the first place. And that's the whole point of this sense of fundamental separation that we have. It's not actually a real thing. It's kind of like you're in the garden and you step on the garden hose. And for a minute you think it's a snake and you jump back and you're filled with fear. And then you look down, oh, it's just a garden hose. We don't have to root out our beginning notion that it was a snake, right? As soon as we see through the illusion, it wasn't there in the first place. And so the individual, separate, freestanding self is like that. We see through it and it vanishes. It doesn't have to be gotten rid of or rooted out. So we're still there in terms of our personality. That doesn't go anywhere, but we're more, if anything, fully ourselves when we let go of this false sense of the small, separate self. So all we really lose is the suffering that comes with defending a mistaken story about who we are, which is basic human everyday life. We're doing that all the time. I feel kind of a calling to demystify this notion of no self a little bit, so it doesn't feel so distant and unattainable and esoteric and weird. For instance, a lot of you have been working on the koan who. So it's a great question. Basically, the question is, who are we really? It's in a way, it's our whole subject matter in Zen, is examining the true nature of the self and its relationship to reality. It's the kind of question that brought many of us to Zen in the first place. And it can always be, it's a question that we can always go deeper and deeper with, and there's kind of infinite depth to it. Of course, our true nature is not other than what we are now. Um, but there's a deeper level to that question, though a lot of us miss. In a way, every koan's about that same question: who are we? What are we doing here? What is life on Earth all about? What's the deal? You know, I've been talking to people, of course, a lot of you in Doksan, and a lot of you either have just finished working on or still working on Nonsense Peony, which is it's one of my favorite koans. It's a great koan, not to be picking and choosing or anything, but I like that one a lot. So in a way, it's about the same thing. You know, what is a flower really? How do we know? Do we know what it really is? Who's the one who's looking? I mean, who's the one who's asking the question? I mean, what's going on with the friggin' flower? So it's in a way an encapsulated set of those questions that we ask about our own lives. And I'm sure we've all felt that. It's like, oh my God, it's like this? What? You know, why is it? Nobody told me, you know, that life was like this. So, you know, what is it really all about? Why is there life and death? What's the deal? So it's all part of the same investigation in a way, whether you're working with a koan or whether you're working with the breath or with just sitting practice. So I want to give you some hints on how to approach it. So one thing many of you have heard me say before is when we're in sesshin, our business is not to leave reality. So actually that's our business in the whole of life, but in sesshin we get to practice it in a very focused way. What that means is to stay present, because that's the only place the reality of our lives actually happens, is right in this present moment. I think we all know that the past has echoes into the present in terms of effects it had upon our bodies and minds and hearts, but that's not the same as it being actually here. And the future, well, we all know cases of people who were going through their lives, no doubt, just like we are, thinking about what's coming next and what they're going to do later, and what they're going to do next week, and what happens when they're old, and their life just stops unexpectedly, and none of that happens. I mean, I could keel over right now. It could happen, right? We never know when that's going to happen. I'm sure such things have happened. So wouldn't that be a dramatic a way to conclude a Dharma talk if I could time it, right? So to stay with our direct experience of reality means to stay with our present moment experience. And in sesshin, we have this great container to do that. It's the only way we're ever going to find our true nature anyway, right? We're not going to find it in some imaginary other time. Even if we discover our true nature 10 years from now, it will be now when it happens, right? So now's the only place we're ever going to realize ourselves. So if we don't want to miss the truth of our life, which is where we find everything we're looking for, then we need to pay attention to this present moment. It's a good thing to think about. We can not leave reality, which basically happens through thought. We're either thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future, or we're analyzing, conceptualizing this moment. Whichever of those things we're doing, we're removing ourselves from our direct experience. So our job in sesshin is direct experience. Eat when we eat, work when we work, sit when we sit, walk when we walk. Do doksan when we do doksan. Just be present for a week. It's fairly simple. As we all know, it's not easy, right? So, as I've said before, this means in reality being only this present moment, we're spending our entire lives together. And I've got to say, you're a pleasant group of folks to be doing that with. So much better than, say, a group of politicians or something, you know. So So my point is, if you're going to realize your true nature, we might as well give it our best effort now, because now is the place it lives. It's the only place we're going to find it. So I want to give you a few hints about how we might approach this, and how we might look at the self and our self nature, which is at least a fundamental subject of what we investigate in Zen practice, and how we free ourselves from suffering. So let me demonstrate what I mean. Let's just take a minute, turn inward, look into our direct experience, and without leaving reality, that's against the rules of this game, ask yourself who you are without leaving now. Just take a moment and do that. Now we have to finesse this a little bit. Not leaving now means you can't dredge up anything from memory. You can't bring up, without dredging from memory and exiting now, you don't know your name, your age, your profession, your gender. Don't know a thing about ourselves, right? To do that, we have to pull from the past, from past learning. So don't worry, those relative details in our lives are not going to be lost. They'll still be accessible, even if we completely realize our true nature as a much bigger self than we ever imagined. We're still going to be able to grab those small self details and download them when we need them. When, for instance, we have to withstand an IRS audit, or we get pulled over by a cop or something, we're going to need to account for ourselves in very conventional terms, right? I was talking to a student about this yesterday, a student in this session, and she said something that was really funny that amused us both. It was something like, I hope I quote her right, but I was using the example of, if a cop pulls us over, we'll have to present who we are in conventional terms, right? And she said, yeah, I guess when he asks for my ID, I can't just tell him, I am the clouds, I am the wind, right? We're going to have to account for ourselves in those conventional terms. So that doesn't go away. Our individual identity, it'll still be accessible when we need it. We just don't have to believe that's the whole of reality. It's actually, if you think about it, all that past data about who we are, it's imaginary, isn't it? It's just a bunch of thoughts. I mean, we can't grab that past self and, I don't know, take it out for a bike ride, go shopping with it. You know, it's not there. It's not graspable. It's not real, right? So without thinking that story of ourselves, it doesn't even appear. It doesn't rise to consciousness. We have to go into storage of the past and bring it forward. But if that's not who we are, because who we are in reality is happening now, isn't it? And we don't have access to that because we're not leaving reality. Well, then what's left? Who are we? And so this is the question we're looking at. So I think even though we went to this place in the now where we're not pulling from the past, that doesn't mean that we turned into the next person in the room, right? We're still here individually. So what's the nature of that experience of being here? You know, as a Sean or as a Todd or as a Kristen or whoever else we are. If we stay with reality, what we are is already pretty stripped down, isn't it? No self is a big territory. It's a big wilderness, but this is an entry point to it. Aren't things already much simpler in who we are, in who we really are, who we actually are in reality? The other way to look at it is, right now, does anyone have a problem? If something's hurting, okay, you got a problem. But most moments are much like this one. We would have to import a problem from our conceptual thinking. Problems usually have to do with things that happened in the past. We're afraid they're going to happen again in the future, or something similar will happen. There's definitely times for tussling over things with the analytical mind. It's a wonderful tool, but it's absolutely useless in Zazen. So it's the conceptual mind is kind of a shorthand for reality. It breaks reality into pieces so we can model reality in our minds. And it creates great things. It created the building that the Abbey is housed in, right? That had to be thought of, planned, projected into the future, all of those things. But that happens by breaking it down to doors, windows, joists, I don't know, all the things that houses are made of, and understanding how to put them together. We can't use a partial tool of the mind to grasp wholeness, to grasp the wholeness of what we really are, which is what we're talking about when we let go of the small self. We gain the universe, we gain a sense of wholeness that that is what we came from and what we're going back to. And in between, we have this little dream of who we are that isn't really accurate. And it's not really satisfying, is it? If we were really satisfied with that small story of who we were, the kind of thing we say at a cocktail party, that's why a lot of us hate cocktail parties, right? Who am I? What do I do? Who am I married to? Where do I live? All these things. And it just seems false, but we know intuitively in some way it's false, right? So if that was satisfying to us, we wouldn't be here with our knees and backs aching and fighting fatigue and trying to raise our energy again and again to keep going back to the practice. Of course, those are just the impediments. The wonderful things are truly wonderful, but these are often the things we face, right? We wouldn't be doing that if we were satisfied with a small sense of self. We know somehow something's not right about it. So that's an entryway to this vast territory of no self. There are many different aspects and many different ways of looking at it. But again, let's just go back to, we can't project into the future. We can't load from the past. And let's not, if we can avoid, the main problem with the present is we judge it. So, which means we're evaluating how we're doing and whether the next person over is, well, Corinne's got a shaved head. She must be enlightened. I'm not sitting as well as I could never sit as well as Corinne. She probably knows self already, right? That kind of thinking, is weighing and evaluating, is just reinforcing our sense of who we are as a small self, right? So no past, no future, no judging. What's left? What's left in our experience if we just again look inward to our experience? So don't we still feel like we're here? We're aware. I don't think we can deny that there's this sense of being present and aware, right? And then there's stuff that comes up in awareness. So perceptions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, whatever. I think if we're looking for our true nature, we know that those objects that appear in awareness, including the whole story of who we think we are, if we download that, those are all objects of awareness. They can't possibly be our true nature because aren't we the ones who are aware of it? So we're standing in that awareness, which is bigger than anything that appears in it, right? Why don't we take a moment and see if we can see how big that awareness is? What I mean is, for right now, just letting any objects that appear in awareness be. And what we're looking at is the space in which things appear. So you'll notice, for instance, that sounds are separated by space. We can more or less tell what direction they're coming from. They're not the same as the next sound. They're often separated from the next sound by space, or even if they overlap, spatially, they're coming from different places. Same thing with our bodies. My sensation right now in the ball of my foot is not the same as the sensation in my shoulder. They appear as though in this space. There's a spatial quality to it. We don't tend to notice the space. if a thought comes into our mind, sometimes we say our mind is filled with thoughts. How do we know it's filled with thoughts instead of one thought? It's because there might only be a little glimmer of space, but there's some sense that there's space around the thought. That space is the field in which it appears, right? Sound appears, sensation appears, thoughts appear. We say thoughts appear in our mind. We're intuiting that there's something called our mind, which in itself is rather nebulous. But things rise to awareness, and we recognize that. We just don't tend to focus on it. It's like walking into a room and seeing the space instead of being focused on the objects, right? So what I'd like you to do is look out towards if you really relax into that space, and you look out towards where the horizon would theoretically be in this space. Helps to close your eyes. I should have said that before. Ask yourself how far that space extends. That space of awareness. Now, it's not uncommon that people feel like, okay, there's some kind of an edge to it. Surely this awareness doesn't go beyond my aura, or it doesn't go beyond the next street over, or it certainly doesn't go into the next county. But so those are all concepts that may come in and block the actual experience. But the thing to consider is, if you feel that you experience an end or a barrier or a boundary, or an edge to this awareness, then notice that again is just another object appearing in awareness. So awareness is always bigger than anything that appears in it. If we had more time, and I'm happy to talk to any of you about this in Doksan, we could explore this more fully and ask some questions about it. But what most people perceive, if you really let your mind stretch out, is that there's no edge to this awareness. We can't tell where it stops. You can try this when you're next on the cushion. Instead of looking, we tend to be fastened on the things that come up in our minds. We don't tend to notice the space of awareness in which it all appears. There's good reason for this evolutionarily. We have a big mesa out here in Taos that just goes on and on and on flat for a long time. And I think 10,000 years ago, if I was a hunter-gatherer here, anything that moved against the space, anything that was an object in that space would be important, because I'm either going to eat it, fight with it, or mate with it, probably, right? So things that move against space are important to our survival. But in sitting practice, anything that appears in the space can't be our true nature, right? In the space of awareness, because that's singular, that's partial. So the conceptual mind likes to break things into pieces so it can move them around and model them, kind of like you manipulate pieces on a chessboard, right? But in the game of Zazen, nobody can win that chess game. So we're going to the more holistic view, the bigger view of who we are. So if I was to ask you who you are right now, you might, for instance, answer, well, I'm a person sitting in a chair. You're trying to keep out of going into the past, right? Because you're following the rules. Okay, I'm a person sitting in a chair. But once you become a person sitting in a chair, in a sense, that's absolutely true, right? You might even present that. You might even present the action of sitting in a chair if you were asked a certain question in examining the koan who. And our individual nature is not separate from our true nature. But once you've made yourself you've decided that you're a person sitting in a chair, then you have to say who's aware of that person sitting in a chair. Once we conceptualize ourselves like that, then we've made who we think we are into an object again. I hope that makes sense. Our question is, who's the subject? Who or what is perceiving these objects that come into awareness? So, didn't Corin quote Dogen as saying something like that, let the myriad things come to rest? This is what I'm talking about. All the stuff that appears in awareness, they're all myriad things. We let them come to rest, and then we're looking at, okay, what's left? Well, if you really look at your awareness and you accept that anything that appears in it, including any edge or boundary, becomes another object of awareness, and therefore awareness is not stopped by it. Most people will agree that our awareness seems to not have edges. It seems to be limitless. So this is none other than the awareness we were born with. One of the reasons we sometimes call it original mind. We were born with awareness, and it's a really good exercise to remember that. Because when we were born, until we learned words, which is where we started to learn concepts and where we started to learn how to think, we did not have a notion of a separate self. We didn't have any notion that the world was broken into separate things. In fact, there's been research done, really interesting research done with people who had congenital cataracts and had surgery. There was a team of physicians in the 1950s who went all over the country, and when cataract surgery became easy and portable, they went all over the country searching for people who'd been blind since birth and removing their cataracts and giving them sight. And Annie Dillard writes about this in her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, and it's in the chapter called Seeing. It's a great book about, for lack of a better word, mystical awareness in some sense. Not like we do it, from a different angle, but very illuminating. So she talks about this research that was done, and when people into their 70s, maybe 80s, were given sight suddenly when they never had it, and infants were given sight, and teenagers and children, thousands of people were given sight by this team of physicians. When a person is given sight as an adult, they do not see the world as we see it, which is, when we see it, there's apparent depth to our vision. The strange thing is that apparent depth, which means there's me over here and things over there, which means separation. That's not the way we saw things at birth, and it's not the way that newly sighted people see the world. That imposition of me here, stuff over there that isn't me, is that kind of separation is an imposition of the mind. It's a processing that goes on in the mind. People who see the world for the first time when the bandages are taken off, what they see is a flat field of color and shape, like a quilt or like a jigsaw puzzle, just perfectly flat. They don't know what the things are even, because they don't, the way we see things, which is there's an edge. Well, I've got a ping pong table here and a fan over there. The edge of the fan and the edge of the ping pong table, to me, define their separation from each other, right? But what if we saw edges as the way things are joined to the universe instead of the way things are separate from the universe? It's all a concept. It's just conceptual. It's a conceptual addition. Isn't it strange to think the eye and the basic optical function would see everything as, can you even try that now? Try it for yourself. Just look out from where you are, and can you kind of suck the depth of? Imagine how the world would look if we hadn't processed it into separate bits. We built that, we processed it. It's like we built up the world as we see it as separate objects, and we also assembled ourself in much the same way through conceptual means. It's much like kids build up a Lego set, right? We just took pieces, stuck them together. We took certain pieces and called them me, and certain stuff that the table over there isn't me, the fan's not me. This kind of oblong thing in the bottom of my vision, I know that's my leg, that's part of me. But if I was just given vision, I wouldn't even know that. And we've all seen infants, they don't know this thing waving around in front of their eyes is part of me, and I'll eventually be able to do something with it. It's just like, whoa, look at that, it's floating. What's that? So, of course, the relative side of things we all know well. We need it. We don't want to walk around in that state of oneness all the time. We don't want to become one with the oncoming traffic, right? We want to differentiate ourselves when it's appropriate. But we all tend to come here because we want to see the other side of things. We're missing that sense of unity. So my point being that we're the ones who split the world up into separate pieces and split ourselves up as something separate apart from the world. We could, in fact, even if we could kind of draw that mental sensation of depth and distinction off the world and just see it as those color patches, well, we'd be right embedded in it, wouldn't we? We wouldn't be separate from it, you know? So we don't want to think about this all too much. Like I say, it's experience, the looking at things through this kind of a thought experiment. Okay, if we let go of objects of awareness, we rest in awareness, we look how far it goes, we understand that anything that appears in it can't be as big as the awareness. Maybe this is our true nature. I'm going to take a closer look. You know, it gets us to that edge. Then you take the closer look, right? Thinking about it's not going to get us there. It's the wrong tool for the job. So the next question that comes up is, if Todd's awareness is infinite, and my awareness is infinite, and Joni's awareness is infinite, and Shish and Roshi's awareness is infinite, what does that say about our awarenesses? Every human being presumably has access to this awareness. It's a natural part of our equipment. So there's about 8 billion of us. Does that mean we somehow have 8 billion separate infinite awarenesses? I don't know, maybe stacked one on top of the other like pancakes or something? No, it doesn't make any sense, does it? You know, could it be that awareness is universal, and that what's looking out at me now through Corin's eyes and what's looking out through me at all of you, that's the same awareness, and everything else we think of as the self is window dressing. It's conditioning that got laid on top of it. If we were getting theistic here, that might sound a universal awareness that at least all human beings share. We don't know how far it goes beyond that. That's starting to sound a lot like what they call God, right? You know, we don't have to personify it. Once you personify it, it starts to feel like my fan. It's over there. God's over there. You know, that's not the way we see it in Buddhism. Whatever that universal nature, that universal awareness is, it's only to be found here inside of us. Right? The strange thing is, it's in plain sight. We're just conditioned to see the objects that appear in awareness. We don't tend to look at the awareness that receives it. Could it be that's where we look for our true nature? In this place that is aware but has no edges? That, yeah, some people could quibble and say, oh, that's all a trick of the mind. Yeah, quibble if you want, but it sure looks to me, from my own experience, that, you know, that might just be the place to look for who we really are. Not outside the world of separation. We're not going to find it in the world of separation, are we? Everything I think of as Sean is just more stuff that appears in awareness. It's just more stuff. You know, don't we want to know what the ground is? Don't we want to know maybe if we even if we look closely at those objects that appear in awareness, we might even ask ourselves, well, what are those made of? You know, if the awareness is infinite, maybe it goes kind of inside those too. Maybe that's what everything's made of, really, at the bottom, if you went far enough. I don't know. These are interesting questions to ask. I've been reading Shishin Roshi's manuscript and giving a little feedback for his manuscript on the five ranks of Tozan, which has a lot to do with the absolute and relative. We're talking about absolute and relative here. Relative is the stuff that appears in our awareness, right? We're looking for what the absolute is. You know, what else is going on? And Roshi's book, he quotes Ramana Maharshi to get back to who. There's a method of self-inquiry that's used in the non-dual school of Hinduism. It's kind of epitomized by Ramana Maharshi, great Indian saint. Yeah, we're not the only ones who know about non-duality. So they use this method of self-inquiry that's very similar. It's like, well, who's having this experience now? You know, but let's not get lost in the experience. Dogen calls it taking the backward step. Take the backward step. Okay, what's receiving all this? What's more of a ground than the things that appear in the ground? So they keep asking, and then when you think you found something else, you ask again. Okay, who's perceiving this? Well, I have a perception now that's a little bit bigger of somebody perceiving this, maybe. Well, who's perceiving that? And in fact, let's try that for just a minute. So let's go back to that awareness. Got stuff passing through it. The stuff passing through it is not our main point. So we're undeniably aware of things that are arising. So for the moment, let's accept, okay, that's a truer nature, at least, than what we normally live with. Can we kind of freeze a sense of a bigger self out of that? Okay, so this is me now. I got the real thing. It's this big awareness. This is the true self. Can you feel that kind of as selfing? Can you kind of let it crystallize into a sense of self? But then you have to ask, so who's aware of that? Right? Oops. So my awareness must be bigger than the awareness that I was just looking at. Okay, now I've got it. Now it's really big. Okay, let's focus there. Okay, I feel I'm really big. I got a really big sense of self going. All right, let's crystallize that. Yeah, I found it now. Wait a minute. Who's aware of that? Right? It's, the phrase reductio ad absurdum. That's what we've got here. You keep stepping backward from what we think is the self, and you can go on forever. You can spend the rest of the session doing this, and you'll never get to an ultimate self where it all stops, right? It's like a hall of mirrors. When we talk about no self, could that be some of what we're talking about? Again, not to think about it. We might have a thought about it. I'm speaking in thoughts, aren't I? You're receiving my thoughts. But then we go and we check it out through experience, not thinking about it. You can go and do that, stepping back and back and back for yourself and see where it leaves you. Well, the Ramana Maharshi quote that I'm trying to get around to is, he says the question, I'm going to paraphrase him a little, the question who is not really meant to get an answer. The question who is meant to dissolve the questioner. So ultimately, how far into yourself can you go and see if there's really what the questioning of all the koans and the questioning of who and mu and all of that does is lead us deeper and deeper and deeper into the great mystery that is our life. It's not going to yield an A plus B equals C kind of answer to what existence is and why we're here. But the more we penetrate into the mystery, the more we can the more we become certain of its deep significance and profundity, even if we can't grasp it. So deep significance and profundity of who we actually are, which that's more than enough for this journey. We touch that, we won't have a problem. It's like with the poet Rilke says something like in his letters to a young poet, he says something like, you'll eventually live through to the answers. So we eventually practice through to innately feeling the truth of our existence and who we are. So anyway, that's probably enough talking. Let me see if I wrote a brilliant conclusion, or even a moderately okay conclusion. A useful conclusion. So, there's a famous Suzuki Roshi quote that I wanted to share, which is, he's talking about exactly this, the difference between awareness and objects of awareness, or if you like, the absolute and the relative. He says the foreground of life is always losing its balance against the background of perfect balance. Isn't that great? The awareness is untroubled by what appears in it. If we accept that that's fundamental to our nature, there's some part of us that is not upset by whatever problems or issues we're going through. In fact, we have to step out of reality, unless we're hurting right now, which sometimes happens. But if we're not hurting right now, we would have to step out of reality to find a problem, right? Sometimes we have to tussle with the problem because that's the relative side of life and we have to sort things out. So, we got to take care of the relative side. That's part of practice too. But boy, it sure puts things in a different perspective when you really see that. Oh, I got to make up a problem for there to be a problem. Even if you are hurting right now, maybe it's not a problem. If we're not trying to get away from it or make something better, isn't that what the ego self, small self, is always doing? I don't like this moment. I'd like a different moment, right? But then we're stepping out of reality. We're nowhere near reality if we're trying to aim for a different moment, right? You just stay with this one. So that's all we got to do in session. So try to catch ourselves when we want to leave reality. And we want to leave it for a lot of reasons. We get uncomfortable, we get tired, we get bored, we want some entertainment. So these are all ways the mind seeks for a better moment than the one we've got. But we're automatically leaving reality when we do that. So our task in session is don't leave, just stay right here. It's actually natural if you let yourself sink past the restlessness, the boredom, the desire for diversion, all that stuff. But you want to keep the spirit of inquiry. It's not passive. We're interested in the landscape. We're interested in what we're seeing. We've just stepped into this big territory of no self. Aren't we interested in it? Well, we better be, but not in the way we think about it, in the way we're paying close attention. It's the same. We will find ourselves becoming interested if we leave space for that in much the same way that we become interested when we're on vacation. You're on a train to Munich. You don't have to make an effort to want to look out the window. Of course you want to look out the window. You're on vacation, right? But it's rejuvenating. It's not a strain. We're just being drawn into it because we're interested. So if we stay with reality enough, we can find that same quality of interest, that same quality of it drawing us in almost effortlessly. In fact, we may realize that to think or to leave reality, we have to make an effort. If we look closely, we'll find that's true. Every time we try to leave reality, there's an element of effort, of strain. No wonder we're exhausted all the time because we're always trying to leave reality, aren't we? The whole culture is about that, right? So if you let yourself just rest here in reality, as Corin reminded us, to enjoy that state of peace. There's a state of peace, there's a state of, I don't know, let's not bother it with labels, then we're getting into concepts. It's a good feeling. You're allowed to enjoy it, okay? It doesn't have to be a grim grind. That the awareness is just there all the time. When you touch it, when you touch that sense of stillness maybe for a moment where nothing is in it, it feels good. So can we just try and stay there? And it actually doesn't take effort to stay. It takes effort to grab the next diversion. So see if that's not true. And then if you don't like any of this, come and complain to me in Dokusan. That's what I'm there for. So, and we'll talk about it further. But yeah, give it a try. This is a great adventure we're setting off on into this realm of no self. And it's right here in front of us. That's what we're here for. So let's take a look and see what we find. Thank you all for being here.